Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to tackle a kind of controversial topic in Mormon history. Joseph Smith's first vision.
Yeah, the first vision. Always a good one to spark some conversation.
For sure. Especially because, we've got this stack of research here.
Yeah.
And some of it's pretty critical of the traditional narrative. We've got academic papers, historical analysis, even perspectives from people who, question the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, the sources you sent over, especially the stuff from BYU Religious Study Center and Mormon Stories, they really dig into all the complications around the first vision. It's not just like what happened, but how that story changed over time.
Right, exactly. And the big thing that jumps out, at least for me, is that there are all these different accounts of the first vision. And they don't always match up perfectly.
Yeah, the details, like how many beings were there, or what was the exact message Joseph got, those things kind of shift around depending on which account you're looking at.
And some people, especially those outside the faith, they see this as a huge red flag, like proof that the whole thing's made up.
Right, and that's where this paper by Stephen Harper, First Vision, Suspicion, or Trust, really dives into that exact issue. Instead of starting from a place of suspicion, he's arguing for what he calls a hermeneutic of trust. Basically, he's saying maybe these differences aren't about deception, but about how Joseph's understanding of the experience evolved over time.
Okay, that makes sense. It was a pretty big deal for him, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't necessarily grasp the full meaning of something like that right away.
Exactly. And Harper really goes into how Joseph's earliest accounts, like the 1832 one, they're all about personal forgiveness of sin, which, if you think about it, makes total sense. He was young, he was wrestling with these big spiritual questions.
Yeah, it was a time of religious revivals and all that. So, yeah, that lines up. But critics might say, well, hold on, didn't Joseph change his story later on, maybe to fit his theology as it developed?
Harper addresses that too. He points out that later accounts, especially as the church was growing and facing pushback, they start to emphasize different parts of the vision, like restoring authority, the corruption of other churches, stuff that was relevant to the challenges they were facing. It's not that he's making things up, but the focus shifts.
So, tailoring the message to the audience a little bit. I guess everyone does that to some extent, right?
Right.
But doesn't it seem, a little manipulative?
I wouldn't say manipulative, maybe more like strategic. Think about it. If you're explaining something complex, you start with the basics, right? You wouldn't overload someone with all the theological details right off the bat.
Yeah, okay, I see your point. But one thing that Mormon stories brought up was that, if you look at non-Mormon sources from the 1830s, they hardly mention the first vision at all. Like, it wasn't this big public thing.
Yeah, that's true. And First Vision, Suspicion, or Trust suggests that back then the focus was on tangible things, like the Book of Mormon, the golden plates, concrete proof.
So maybe the first vision was more of a personal thing for Joseph at first, something that, kind of gained importance later on as the church needed a foundation story. Almost like the first vision itself evolved in a way.
That's a really interesting way to put it. It definitely challenges the traditional view of it being this single defining moment that, immediately shaped everything.
Right. And this brings up another tricky thing, how the descriptions of the beings Joseph saw, they change over time. The 1832 version just says, the Lord, but later on it's God the Father and Jesus, totally separate. Critics say, aha, he's making it up. But what do people who defend the account say about that?
Well, this BYU Studies article evaluating 3 arguments against the first vision, they talk about the limits of historical record keeping, Back then, nobody was taking down Joseph's words word for word. And anyone who heard him, they'd be relying on their memory, their own interpretation.
Yeah, that's true. But wouldn't you remember if you saw, one being or two? That seems like a pretty big detail.
They use a good analogy in that article. Imagine someone saying, I saw Mom yesterday. Does that mean they're lying if they later say, I saw Dad yesterday?
Oh, I see what you mean. Both could be true, just emphasizing different parts of the experience.
Exactly. Maybe it's not about adding or changing, but, shifting the focus depending on the context, the audience.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this hermeneutic of trust thing works. It's about trying to understand things from within the historical setting, right? Not just assuming everyone was trying to be sneaky. But but then how do you explain why some of these accounts were like hidden for so long?
Well, to really get that, you got to think about how vulnerable the early church
Oh
was.
yeah, I mean they were facing persecution, right? People were attacking their beliefs.
Exactly. And in that situation, it makes sense that church leaders would, be careful about what they shared.
So like maybe they thought, "Hey, let's not give our enemies more ammunition."
Right. Especially if sharing every single variation of the first vision story might just distract from the core message they were trying to get across.
It's like pick your battles kind of.
Exactly. And it's not that those other details aren't important, but there's a time and a place. And in those early days, they might have felt it was best to present a more, unified front.
This really makes you think about how information is managed even today. Governments do it, companies do it.
Everyone does it, right? Choosing what to share and when, it's all about context, strategy, and that applies to historical narratives too.
This whole conversation has really shifted my perspective. Instead of jumping to, suspicion, I'm seeing how understanding the historical context, the pressure those early church leaders were under, it can help explain their choices.
It's a good reminder that history is rarely black and white. There's so much nuance, motivation, circumstances, it all plays a role.
And it sounds like this applies to way more than just the first vision, right? It's a whole way of looking at history.
Absolutely. It's about acknowledging that the past is complicated and resisting the urge to judge historical figures by our modern standards.
Well said. So where do we go from here? I mean, we've talked about the overall context, but what about the specifics of those different accounts?
Right. In our next segment, we're going to dive into those, the key differences, the possible explanations for why they vary.
I'm definitely intrigued to see where this goes and how it all, ultimately impacts how we understand the first vision today.
All right, so picking up where we left off, I think it's really helpful to remember that each of these first vision accounts, they kind of build on each other. They add another layer to our understanding.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to get stuck on the differences like, oh, this one says this and that one says that. But if you look at them individually, you can see how Joseph's, how he understood the experience. It developed over time.
Right. And it all ties back to what was going on around him historically. Take the 1832 account, for example. It's
Yeah.
it's the earliest written one we have, and it's super personal. It's all about Joseph wanting forgiveness for his sins, feeling this incredible love from God.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, he was a teenager, basically.
Mhm.
And back then, everyone was talking about, like, salvation and getting right with God.
Exactly. It was a time of these huge religious revivals. So, Joseph focusing on his sins being forgiven, it totally fits with what was going on, both for him personally and in the bigger religious landscape. But then as the church starts to grow, and they're facing more opposition, the accounts change a bit.
That's when you get the later accounts, right? The ones
Yeah,
that talk more about, like, priesthood authority being restored and how all the other churches were wrong.
exactly. The 1838 account, the one that's in the Pearl of Great Price now, it gives a much clearer picture of God the Father and Jesus Christ, like two separate beings. And it says that Joseph was told straight up that all the other churches were off track. That's a pretty big shift from the 1832 version.
Yeah, huge. And critics will point to that and say, see, he was just making stuff up as he went along.
Yeah.
But how do people who defend the accounts explain that change?
Well, one argument is that, look, Joseph was young when he had the first vision. It takes time to process something that big. As he matured and as the church grew, his understanding of what it all meant, it naturally deepened.
Makes sense. It's like if something life-changing happens to you, you might not grasp all the implications right away. It takes time to see the bigger picture.
Right. And also, think about the historical context again. As the church faced persecution, theological debates with other groups, Joseph's later accounts might have been shaped by that. They needed to show how Mormonism was unique, different from other Christianity. He wasn't changing the story, but emphasizing different parts, the parts that mattered most at that time.
So less about like personal salvation, more about, building a foundation for a new church.
Exactly. And it's fascinating, isn't it, how the first vision narrative kind of adapts to what the church needed at different points in time.
It is. It makes you think about how, like, historical accounts, they're never totally objective. They're always influenced by by who's telling them, who they're for, and what's happening in the world at that time.
Oh, for sure. And this whole idea that the church like purposely hid some of the accounts, that gets into some really, really interesting territory.
Yeah, because, I mean, weren't they under attack constantly?
Yeah.
Beliefs being mocked, members being, like, literally persecuted?
Absolutely. So put yourself in their shoes. You're trying to build this new church and you're getting hit from all sides, maybe highlighting every little difference in the first vision stories. It just wouldn't have been helpful.
Right, like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, exactly. It could have seemed like a distraction, taking focus away from the core message they were trying to share.
Makes you realize it's kind of like marketing, almost.
Yeah.
You highlight the key points, the benefits. You don't get bogged down in every single detail.
Great analogy. And it's not that those other details don't matter, but sometimes you got to focus on the big picture, right?
So maybe these early church leaders, they weren't trying to be deceitful. They were just trying to, I don't know, protect the church in a tough situation.
That's definitely a possibility worth considering. It's about understanding their motives, their context, not judging them by, 21st century standards.
Right. And it brings us back to that hermeneutic of trust thing. Even if things seem uh, a bit shady at first glance,
Mhm.
maybe there's a deeper explanation.
It's about giving the benefit of the doubt, considering that maybe they were acting with good intentions, even if their methods seem, well, questionable to us now.
This whole discussion is really, I don't know, it's made me think about how I approach history, especially, religious history. It's not always black and white.
Right.
There's so much gray area.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not about finding easy answers. It's about embracing the messiness, the unknowns, and recognizing that even people we revere, they were still human. They made mistakes. They had to make tough choices.
That's a really good point. So where does this all leave us? I mean, we've talked about the different accounts, the context, but how does this all connect to like how we understand the first vision today?
That's the million-dollar question, right? What's the lasting impact of all this? And that's what we'll tackle in the final part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm ready to keep exploring this.
Me too. It's going to be interesting to see where we end up.
But like, what's the takeaway here? Why does any of this matter to, someone listening today?
That's the big question, right? It's easy to get lost in the details, but this whole exploration, it shows us something really important about how we tell stories about the past, especially when it comes to faith and belief.
It's like the first vision, with all its different versions, it's a perfect example of how tricky history can be. Makes you think about memory, bias, what even is truth.
Yeah, exactly. And those questions, they matter way beyond just like religious history. Think about court cases, how eyewitness accounts can be so different, or how historical figures get portrayed in totally opposite ways. Heck, even in our own families, we remember things differently.
Right. It shows you truth is rarely simple. It's not always just like this or that. And this article, evaluating 3 arguments against the first vision, it talks about how even back then, just writing something down, it already involves choices, interpretation.
Yeah, they point out that like Joseph himself struggled with how to even write his history down, and the scribes, they weren't taking down every word perfectly, and then anyone who heard him talk about it later, well, they'd be relying on their own memories, their own way of understanding it.
It's almost like a game of telephone.
Hmm.
The message changes a little each time it's passed on, but that doesn't mean the original message was like a lie.
Right. And this ambiguity, this uncertainty, it's not something to be afraid of. It's an opportunity to think critically, to engage more deeply with the material, to realize that history, it's a process. It's messy, it's always evolving.
And that messiness, it doesn't mean that the experience wasn't real
Yeah.
or that it didn't have a huge impact on people. In fact, maybe by accepting that complexity, we can understand it even better.
Exactly. Like Harper in First Vision Suspicion or Trust, he talks about how coming at these accounts with trust, it can actually open up new ways of seeing things.
Instead of just looking for like contradictions or gotcha moments, it's about trying to understand what Joseph was going through, how his thinking changed over time.
Right. And think about it, even in our own lives, how we describe I don't know, a powerful experience, it might change over time. You tell the story differently to a friend than you did in your diary years ago. Not because you're lying, but because you've processed it, you see it differently now.
That's so true. And I guess that applies to historical accounts too. especially with these, deep spiritual experiences. That early focus on forgiveness, it makes total sense when you consider how old Joseph was, what his worries were.
Totally. And as the church grew, faced these challenges, it's natural that the focus of the story would shift too. Those later accounts about authority, about other churches being wrong, it wasn't necessarily about rewriting history, it was about emphasizing what mattered most at that moment.
So it wasn't deliberate deception, more like responding to what the church needed at that time.
Right. It challenges that idea of like one single truth set in stone. History is more fluid than that. It's shaped by individual viewpoints, by events, by the human struggle to make sense of it all.
This has been, I don't know, really eye-opening. I'm definitely going to think about history differently now. It's not about just being right or wrong. There's so much more to it.
And that's such an important skill, especially today, with all the information out there, the different narratives, being able to look at things critically, but also empathetically, that's huge. The first vision, it's a good reminder that all history, not just religious history, deserves that kind of approach.
Totally. Recognizing our own biases,
Yeah,
understanding that there's always more to learn, and that finding the truth, it's a journey, not just a destination.
well said. So, as we wrap this up, I think the biggest takeaway is humility. Humility in how we look at history, in knowing that we don't have all the answers, and humility in listening to other viewpoints, even when they're different from our own.
That's a great point. It's not about giving up on truth, but about recognizing that the search itself is valuable,
Hmm.
and that sometimes the search takes you down some pretty unexpected paths.
For sure, and that's what makes it all so interesting. So that's our deep dive on the first vision. Hopefully, it's given you some new insights, some things to ponder.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, Deep Divers. It's been a great conversation. And we'll see you next time as we continue to dive deep into all sorts of fascinating topics.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.